And so when you start up OrchidWiz, there's different areas here on the upper right, on the upper left corner, you're seeing things that I've looked at lately. And then there's different areas with different types of functionality. But if you go to the lower bottom corner, there's an area that's related to just species. So if I click, for example, species map, I am looking at a map of the world with particular areas that I can click on to go check out those species. So you will notice, for example, that there are regions of the world with greater than 500 species, and those are in purple here. The buttons are in purple, and others that have less than 500 species, and the buttons are in almost every region of the world, including Antarctica. Although it's only a couple of species there, but almost every region of the world pretty much has orchid species. And so I can click on any of these. Like if I wanted to find out the species of Florida, I could click on the southeast area of the United States, bring up that area, Southeast USA, and then I could specifically, you see, Florida has the greatest number of species in that area, and so I could select that area, bring that area, and then start looking at the specific species in there, and which we will do, and then we'll look at the Baker data. Another way that you can do this is go to areas, particular botanical areas of the world. There's 337. Now, these are not countries necessarily, they're particular areas. So Florida is an area, but Ecuador is also an area. So it could be a country, or it could be a state. And so you see here that Ecuador and Colombia have the largest number of orchids. And if I was looking for a specific botanical area, I would click on the heading, like name, and then it would sort by that. And then I can scroll down and I should be able to find Florida in here. So that definition is defined by botanists, and they have a particular list. There's a whole system, and I don't have the names here now, but there's a whole system that they use to define particular areas of the world as a botanical area. And so it depends on various things, but primarily, remember, we're not just looking at orchids, we're looking at all the plants. And so we're looking at, is there specific diversity when you go to an area versus another? And that's true when you go from Florida to Georgia, for example. And so they have Florida as one area and they have Georgia as another one. But then there's some countries that are small enough that they'll say, the whole country, like Portugal, is one botanical area. The whole country is one botanical area. And then there are countries like Brazil, where instead of doing it by state, they divide Brazil into 5 or 6 regions, and then each region is a botanical area. So they do it, and I just capture that information from them and then use it in OrchidWiz. So in this case, I've looked for Florida because I've sorted by the name. If I click most awarded, those are our most popular species that grow in Florida. You see that one of them is Encyclia tampensis. And I'm going to select this one just to look at the Baker data. So I'm going to click on this button here is the profile, is the species profile button. And it's an analysis in OrchidWiz that tries to bring up everything to do with that species or that hybrid. And it looks very different if it's a species or a hybrid. So in this case, because we're dealing with a species, I have the geographical distribution of Encyclia tampensis, and origin habitat is coming from Baker. People don't know this and they rarely use it, but there's a menu here up on top with various different options. And so I'm going to click list. My second option here is called list. I'm going to click list, and I'm going to click orchids that are the most awarded. And I'm going to select species because this is only about species. And I want the orchid species that have been most awarded in the last 5 years. So I'm going to say, let's start in 2015 till the present, or I could say 2015 until 2019 if I wanted just 5 specific years, because, like, for example, I could be comparing what orchids were the most awarded in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, and so on, right? So I could have I would have a starting year and an ending year, and I would have these time periods. But in this case, starting in 2015, let's list the species. And you see we got Walkeriana is the one that has the most awarded, 240 awards. So now I'm only looking at the AOS. I'm not looking at all the other organizations. Even though I only have AOS and CSA here, when I click outside of this, I have all the different organizations. So AOS, if I click AOS, I'm only looking at AOS awards. So you see Skinneri, Purpurata, Rostralianum. Those are the ones that have been awarded the most, starting in January of 2015. So let's take a look at Cattleya purpurata, for example. I can click on the image, and then I could click profile of Cattleya purpurata, and you can see it blooms at a very specific time. And so if I want to figure out, well, why does it bloom at that time? I could click seasons. We know it blooms in May. And so I could say, okay, so what's happening in April, May? We have a reduction in precipitation going from March into April, and you have the temperatures going up. So there's probably something related to that, to a reduction in precipitation, cutting the water a little bit, and then it's primarily probably the temperatures going up. The diurnal range doesn't seem to change that much. So you can do this for any orchid. I can go back and look at, let's say, Paphsuca kuhlii, do the same kind of thing. And you see now it can pretty much flower any time of the year, but there's certain times of the year that it flowers more than others. And you can do the same kind of analysis and say, okay, is that, let's go back, seasons. Okay, so is there some relation between when does it flower and precipitation and these other things, and try to figure out, okay, so when, what would cause it to flower? So that's the kind of analysis that you want to make. So all the data that we have here, it kind of starts out with the default of Northern Hemisphere, but actually it turns out that, believe it or not, half of our customers are in Australia and New Zealand, because orchids are very popular there. So what do they do? If you're in Australia, if you're in New Zealand, what do you do? And what you do is, I'm going to look for an orchid that has a rest period. So I'm going to look for Catasetum pileatum. So there's Catasetum pileatum. It kind of looks like this. There's females, and there's females here and males here. They look different depending whether they're males or females. Now I'm going to look into, let's go into the profile for that species. And then when I'm looking at my profile, immediately you see you got the flowering over here, right? And the flower, and it says right there, flowering in Northern Hemisphere. Now, when I click that button there, it switches over. You see, I clicked the button there. It switched it over to flowering in Southern Hemisphere. And so now I'm looking, and then from then on, whatever I do in OrchidWiz, I'm there. In fact, I restart OrchidWiz, I'm always in the Southern Hemisphere. It knows that now I only care about, I'm in the Southern Hemisphere, and my data is for the Southern Hemisphere. So even though Bert Hamilton collected all this data for the Northern Hemisphere, in the Southern Hemisphere, you just reverse it. It's the opposite. The seasons are the opposite, so you just reverse that. So I'm going to put it back in the Northern Hemisphere. I'm going to bring up the seasons. Okay, so now we're looking at seasons. And now if I do the same thing here, you see over here on the left-hand side, it says north-south. If I click there, and by the way, there are other ones like, do you want to look at millimeters or do you want to look at inches in precipitation? Do you want to look at Fahrenheit or do you want to look at Celsius? Okay, so you have to click here and adjust for what you're looking at. But once you do it, then it will all, from now on, every orchid you're going to look at, it's going to adjust for that, because it knows that that's where your preference is. If I click the button, you see how it switched, every single graph gets switched around. You see that? Because I'm clicking that button, I'm switching from the Northern Hemisphere to the Southern Hemisphere. So if you're in Australia or New Zealand, that's what you do. You just click that button, and now you're looking at the Southern Hemisphere. It's the same thing, except everything is reversed.